welcome to the Rebase Talks. We're here today to hear from Paola, who's an Italian digital product designer with more than 15 years of experience. She works as a UX UI designer at Cassava, one of the most innovative Italian prop tech startups. And I don't actually know what prop tech is, so maybe we may or may not learn what that is in this talk. She's going to be talking about the history of UIs, user interfaces, and so I am so eager to learn from your experience on the design world. I will mute and hide myself, and the show is all yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. So the prop tech startups are startups that work in a property real estate industry. So we are really technological, but actually we sell so. So, okay, I share my screen. So I hope to do it properly. Okay. Did you see my screen?
No, we don't see your screen right now.
Okay, sorry. Share. Okay, sorry.
We do see your adorable cat though, and that is wonderful.
I'm really sorry.
Do you see the green share screen button?
Yeah, but I have to allow because the new Mac OS have some. Okay, Zoom.
You might have.
I'm so sorry. I have to quit to restart Zoom. I'm really sorry.
Okay. No worries. I will
be right back. Yeah,
I'll hold down the fort while you're gone.
Okay.
All right. I guess this is a reminder to test our technology beforehand, but that's on me as a moderator. I should have made sure our speaker had tested her screen sharing. I'm curious, we have 10 participants here. Does this represent the audience, or are there other people? Is there other places where people may be watching?
Yes, on YouTube.
Okay. Are the people who are watching on YouTube expected to submit questions to me in the Clouder interface? Because I could also just handle chat questions in Zoom. Okay. All right. Well.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Sorry for late. I had some technical issues. And today we're going to talk, as Elena said, about the UI evolution, how UI changed in the past 30 years, but also about the UI in the pop culture, how the movies, TV shows represent the user interface, and this is part of the evolution, you know? So we talk about the UI evolution, about it, but also we'll have a timeline where we're gonna analyze the different era of UI design. To a few words about me, as Elena said, I'm a UX UI designer from Italy. I work and live in Milan. I know this is not the best time to work and live in Milan, but it's okay. And I started to work in the early 2000s and as a webmaster. Basically, I do everything. I do design, development, marketing, content, and so on. So I lived all the user interface era as a professional. So all the trends and the pattern we use through the years are a perfect representation of the actual situation, how we arrived to that. I hope you find this revival enjoyable. I know you're very young and probably you don't remember a lot of this interface, but it's pretty cool to have a confrontation after the talk about your impression about the old era, the old trends we used in the user interface design. So what about the UI evolution? We started talking about the user interface in the mid of 2000s, when the design of digital interfaces started to have an incremental growth, when people in digital industry started to understand that only the visual part of a digital product was not enough. Digital interfaces needed to be designed following certain rules, certain principles, and I'm not talking about the constraints, but the tech constraints, but rules tailored on the user. We started to think about the user, who becomes more and more central in the digital product development. The World Wide Web was invented by a British scientist, Tim Berners-Lee, in 1989, if I remember properly. But we have the first very web page in 1991. He worked on the World Wide Web while he worked at the CERN, the Swiss CERN. So we started to talk about web design, interface design in 1991, and we can say the UI design have the starting point here. Until that date, we were surrounded by interfaces. We had a lot of technological devices. I don't know. The television, we had the ATM, and so on. But today I want to concentrate all my evolution story about the website UI. So we're going to analyze websites interface only, and how those interfaces evolved in the past 30 years, but especially why, because this evolution is not happened without reasons. We have a lot of reasons about the UI evolution, and from the 1991 to 2020, we have a lot of difference, but not only about the graphic part of the UI interface evolution, but is like a logical difference, because we had this kind of websites when when the World Wide Web started, because we had technical and non-technical reason to have it like that. The evolution happened for technical and non-technical reasons, as I mentioned. Technical reasons, why? Because we have, in the past 30 years, the introduction of a lot of new devices. Just thinking about smartphones, smartwatch, smart fridge, smart TV, and so on. Now designers have to think about a lot of technical constraints when they build a new interface. But also new technologies. Code development changed a lot since the early 90s. And I remember when I started working in the industry, I worked also with code, and HTML with CSS inline was enough to create a website. Today, I don't recognize a lot of new code languages and frameworks, because it evolves a lot, really fast. Also, deprecated technologies. Just thinking about Flash, when I started working, Flash was the most technological and modern technology. Now, if I remember properly, December will be the last month of Flash life because it will be deprecated from January 2021. So this is another reason very important to consider. And also all the evolution of hardware and software of our machine. The hardware really evolves a lot. I buy a computer today, and in a week it's already old, and all the web design have to follow these changes because the websites could have a different performance, could have a better performance, better technology, because the machine, the hardware could open these websites because are strong enough. But also we have non-technical reasons. Just think about the variety of users that now visit websites compared to the 90s. I remember when I go to high school at my first year, in Italy we have internet a bit later than, I don't know, US. And I remember in all my year, we were like 1,000 students. Only 2 people, me and another guy, have internet at home. So internet was not diffused at all. It was for a niche of people, and the users were pretty understandable. The user type mostly was professionals, IT professionals, or people that have a lot of knowledge about technology. So it was really simple to understand their need and expectation. And it's very different today, because potentially today a user could be anyone, an old man, a young lady, also people that don't know how to use properly a technological device. Also, another reason that helped to evolve the UI design is that there are a lot of new professionals join the industry year by year. And that's very important, because when we were very few designers, especially in a country, we didn't have a lot of contamination and confrontation between us. But now that a lot of people join the industry and shows their work and exchange information with other designers, the contamination is very fast, and helped to change the trends and the pattern in the UI design world. Also, another very important thing is that there are more competitors on web. In 1991, if I sell shoes, I was just one website that sells shoes. Today, there are a lot of websites that are just like mine, and I have to do something to make a difference and make it better than the others. So the competition, the competitors helped a lot to evolve the UI design story. And also, companies start to invest in design. This is very important. Just think on Google that invest on material design. We have a lot of new principles. We have a lot of new design languages and material and libraries. So we designers have the right basis to create something new and something better than the previous one. So, but why actually web design has changed? Because something has changed not only in the UI part, but also in the way designers think when create an interface. They think different now because if we let's just think about the first 10 years of web design history. Designers saw that if a user doesn't understand a website, it was its entire fault, its entire responsibility, you know, because he wasn't enough tech savvy to understand them. Designers was only concerned about creating something new, something beautiful, enjoyable, but they didn't care so much about usability and the user experience. That sometimes requires you to sacrifice visual part in favor of a better ease to use. Designers was like you're the user in a world created for a small group of person, the people that in the 90s have a personal computer at their home and also have an internet connection. And you have to be a tech-savvy person, and you have to be smart enough to understand my interface. So it's not my responsibility, but it's yours. So the guilt was on the users. But today, this is changed a lot because the responsibility switch from the user to the designer. When the web started to evolve and became more widespread, the user started to be many different types, as I mentioned. They were not only the tech geek and, I don't know, the office workers that need the computer to work, but people with different backgrounds, with different technology and different geo and demo characteristics. The age are different, so we have also the older people, so the younger people, and we have to think about everyone when we create an interface. Designers start to think about everyone, and the approach changed a lot. Everyone should be able to use an interface, and the designer's duty must be to create accessible, usable, and fit for everyone interfaces. The web has become, from that moment, more accessible for everyone and also friendly for people that are tech savvy or not. So the responsibility switch from the user to the designers who are in charge to create something understandable and usable potentially by everyone. And designers began to think about putting the user on the center of their decisions, struggling to know him more and more. They wanted to know their user because knowing their user helps the designer to build interfaces that meet their needs and expectations. So the user-centered design approach started to be followed more and more by designers, and all the interfaces created are tailored on the user and not only on, I don't know, the trends or the taste, the graphical taste of the designer. So the way we design UI has changed very, very much since the start. But not only the way we design has changed, but also our roles. As I mentioned, I started as a webmaster because I started to work in the early 2000s, and there was a very few professionals in the web industry. And people that build a website basically do everything. So in Italy, we call this person a webmaster. I don't know if elsewhere is the same, but webmaster basically do all the web-based action that that are destined to create a website. But this happens for I don't know 10 years, I think, because something changed when I started to work in 2002, but in 2004 just my position changed, and we became a web designer. That's because the webmaster role split up in web designer and front-end developer, because the development part becomes more and more complicated, and they need knowledge more technical, and he became a developer and not a designer as in the past. The web designer basically works only on the visual design of a website. But we was in the era when the designer was someone that have a very good taste and create very good visuals. So we didn't think about the user, and we didn't do research about the users. So another change has happened in 2007, 2008, I think, and the web designer role split up in other different roles. There are a lot, I know, but the most important are UI designer and UX designer. UI designers are designers that are more technical because they draw the interface, they know basics of front end, and they work a lot with the tech team. The UX designer is a more strategical part, more strategical and research part, because he needs to know the user most, and he discover if the product or the feature he is going to design, sorry, meets the needs and expectations of the user. Basically, UI and UX designers work together, but in a lot of company, these two figures are in one person. Like in my company, we are 3 UX UI designer, and we cover both the part. But we had to study for both the roles. Also, there are more specific roles, right, like UI engineer, that are more like the first front-end figure. They have just HTML, CSS with preprocessor in order to give the interface semi-built to tech team, and they attach the eventually attach the framework or the backend. Also, there are people that only do research. They only do user interviews. They only do focus group and so on. And there are also other people that are only a managerial roles. But it's very clear that the evolving of the role of the people that create websites, create the interface, affect a lot also the website and the interface evolution. And also, another thing that I found really important to mention is the democracy of web design. We also lived when we switched from the 90s and the 2000s, a big change when the web development began something more democratical, because there were a lot of services that allow people who aren't professional in the web industry to build their own website without technical knowledge. I remember when I was a teenager, GeoCities, which has a site builder, very simple, and I create my first website about Backstreet Boys, I remember. But the very exponential growth of the trend started in the early 2000s, when the blogging platform became very popular. You had the chance not only to create your blog, but to create templates, make interface personalization, use CSS, use HTML. I remember there was a lot of blog that wasn't actual blogs, but more similar to a website. And the fact that not only professionals, but also normal people, who use the internet for passion in their free time, was able to create websites, helps to spread the pattern and trends in the UI design, in web design. I don't know, I mentioned just three type of services, but I know I'm sure that in other countries there are a lot of similar ones. The blogging platforms like I don't know, Blogger, LiveJournal, the site builders like GeoCities, but also the first example of social media, Netlog, MySpace, was spaces where you can personalize your space with HTML and CSS, and it's very important because most people that use those services wasn't web designers or web developer, was people that want to have a presence of the internet. And I want to mention that in Italy we had SPLINDER. SPLINDER was really, really great. Everyone struggled to create the best website, best blog ever. SPLINDER was really similar to Blogger or LiveJournal. And there was a lot of people that have a SPLINDER blog with only to give for free SPLINDER templates. So they create a very big community around the services, and everyone have their personal space on SPLINDER. And the fun part was that there was a community, so you could find a website or a blog that match with your interest, and there was a lot of potential in it. Unfortunately, they had like a fire, if I remember properly, and they had to close because all of their servers was gone. So it's time for our timeline. We started to talk about UI design evolution. As I mentioned, we have a lot of difference if we compare the first sorry, UI web page, UI of our web page in 1991, and one UI design of the actual days. There was a lot of things to mention, but we have a short time, and I try to concentrate in a period of some years the explanation, but I'm sure that the topic could be more explain in details if we had more time. So start with the early 90s, the very beginning of the user interface history. First website basically was very, very similar to the first CERN web page. We didn't have a lot of graphics. We didn't have a lot of visual content, both because there wasn't a lot of CSS and HTML tags. CSS was like code that you put in line in HTML tag, so you have a very small possibility to build something more graphical. Basically, we have some links and some text, and also another reason is because internet was really slow. Internet connection was really slow compared to the following years, and I think also abroad, but in Italy we didn't have an internet flat subscription. So we pay what we use, and if you open something that requires a lot of time to finish its download, you pay a lot. So the technical part was really impactful for this era of the UI design. But the second era I want to mention is my favorite. Late 90s, early 2000s. Everything was really wild because everyone wants to do experiments on UI design, web design. And this period doesn't have a very specific style, but a wide range of trends, and it was mixed to create websites. We had a lot of trends, of components, of patterns, of services we can use in our websites, but we mix them without a very specific rules. That probably happened because it was the very first stage of the web design evolution, and designers wanted to experiment new things, new styles. They were curious about the potential of web design. Everything was still to be discovered, and the contamination and the mix between different styles was quite common. So we're trying to analyze some of my favorite trends. Started to animated pattern navigation. All the navigation, the navigation menu, and very often the buttons was graphical. So we created them in Photoshop. We saved as JPEG, and we put it in the website. So basically a website like that was 80% composed by images. So imagine nowadays a website like that opened in a smartphone or a tablet, it's like a mess. But also one of the main trends, but the main pattern we used to create websites was the iframe websites. See in the boxes you could see in this UI, there are all iframes. We use iframes to create sections and menu. So it was pretty popular to use a lot of it. In a website, you could have also 6 or 7 iframe, and it was not a crime. Also, another very, very popular and oh my God, scared. I'm scared. Trends was the animated and patterned backgrounds. It was really common to use a pattern as a background, but there was some websites that use animated images as a background. So today, something like that is like a crime, because the user attention is all focused on on the movements of the images, and he didn't read text or use the website properly. Also, we wanted always to know how many people was on our website, or how many people visited our websites. I remember it was some websites that give you free counters with different graphics, and the counter was not only a feature that helps you to understand how many sessions you had on your website, but also was ornamental components you align to the rest of the website. Also, since the interaction was not like nowadays, we didn't have social media, we didn't have all the messenger services. So one of the best way to keep in touch with your users was to have a guest book. The guest book was like a space where where a user could leave a feedback or a message to the creator of the website, and 99% of the guest books was public, so people could read the other users what think about your website. Another very popular trend was the trailing cursor, and like the counter and the other very noisy trends, was something that you align to the rest of the graphic. So there was a lot of kind of different cursors. It was something more elegant, something more playful, like that, like the one in slide. And if I remember properly, it was like a JavaScript code that was offered online for free, and you could custom with your favorite things and the favorite design. But also the most beloved designers, technology was the Flash websites. When you build a website with Flash, you were a very good designer, and you had to learn ActionScript, that was the code for develop Flash websites, and Flash gave a lot of opportunities to customize your UI, and a designer in early 2000 that was able to create Flash websites was a designer very good and very modern for the time. Also, another mention to the small centered layouts. We worked potentially only on a resolution 800 per 600 pixels, and designers, we loved the small layouts. Those layouts could be Flash or iframe layouts, and it was often centered like the Comedy Central UI that was the most popular structure, but sometimes it was a line on in the left corner, like the Pepsi World layout, but it was like a personal choice of the designer. Also, in nowadays we have some contamination from these years. As you imagine, it was a very experimental phase, and a lot of people loved the retro design of these years, the pixel design, and so on. And this is a website, a recent website of our car leasing service in the UK, linkscar.com. I suggest you to visit after the talk, because follow all the trends and the pattern of the late 90s and early 2000s, all in one website. So it's very, very representative of the era. But also, when Marvel's Captain Marvel movie was out, they used the website to promote the movie with a 90s UI, because the movie is the movie is in the 90s era, and it was really, really good, and also it was responsive. So it was interesting to see a website like that seen properly on the smartphone. It was a very good experiment. So finish with the most experimental phase of the UI. We start to slowly come to nowadays. The period between 2004 and 2010, we have the skeuomorphism. It's very difficult to pronounce for an Italian. Skeuomorphism era, and it was a very appreciated trend during these years, and incorporated the pattern of the real world, like, I don't know, the pattern of the wood, of the iron, of the wood, in a digital representation. One of the most famous skeuomorphism UI was in the iOS system, the app iBooks, that want to emulate a wood shelf, and it was like one of the most emulated from the designer during these years. There are some skeuomorphic websites. As you can see, we have a lot of 3D. We have a lot of textures, and all the components and the content of the website should appear real. The piece of cake, or the plate, or the paper with the notebook looks very realistic if you compare to the actual pattern of the UI design. After that period, we have one of the most beloved by designers. Between the 2010 and 2014, everything changed. shadows became the worst enemy of a designer, and the interfaces became a big flat artboard made by boxes and text only, few images, and all the shadows, all the gradients, all the texture was not a trend anymore. Flat design was loved a lot by designers because was a minimalistic style. We use a lot of bright colors or pastel colors. We started to focus more on the space between the components, on the typography, on the contrast ratio, but basically it wasn't perfect because cut out totally shadows don't help the accessibility of an interface because all the components was on the same level for the human perception. So it was a very beloved trend, but it was a phase. It was just a phase. As you can see, designers use a lot of colors, of simple illustrations. In the visual design industry, it was a lot of flat icons, flat illustrations that UI designers put in their interfaces. But flat design was not perfect, okay, but was crucial to the actual UI design trends, because after that we have the actual UI design style. I mentioned only the material design, but at the moment we use material design as a basis to create interfaces, but we mostly use the usability principles, the accessibility rules to create websites, not only following the material design library, but mostly following the user needs, especially when there are users with special needs. The material design is a language created by Google, and and it's the most influential language style created since 2015. We designers called material design a design framework because just like to the front-end frameworks, Google create a repository with all the library, the components, and which is documented by a very specific documentation. So when you want to create a material design layout, you have just follow the documentation, and you can replicate 100% the material design layout, basis layout. Why is important? Because the style is pretty similar to the flat design, but he used the gravity, because components in material design are on the are overlaid between them. So if a component is on another, you perceive that because you have a proper shadow. So today we use material design, but I think in the following time we are switching to something more and more accessible, thinking about how to give our website not only the right perception, but also the right but also we wanted to that our websites follow the right rules for accessibility. Just a few examples of websites nowadays. We have big contrast ratio between the background and the components and the text. We have a lot of rounded corner with a big border radius. Also in social media. Social media follow all the rules of UI design. Big and clear font size, big buttons, and also, and at first we design for mobile, so all the UI we imagine that all the UI nowadays are primarily open on a smartphone or on a tablet, so that's why we use bigger fonts or bigger buttons or components. So our evolution is finished, and I want to talk about UI design in pop culture. I'm going on a rush because I'm late, as I see. So UI design in pop culture. We have a lot of contamination from the real world to the artificial world of movies, TV shows, music video, and so on. And the interfaces that are represented in the pop culture was not 100% accurate than the real ones, but it's very interesting to understand how they manipulated it and why. This was one of the first UI design I remember. It was in Jurassic Park, and I found these interfaces realistic and well done for these years. They reflected the actual interfaces at the time. And I don't know if you have seen the movie, but this quote was very popular in the tech industry, because a lot of people that see a computer probably for the first time in the big screen think that a file manager in a computer was like that. But at the time, a real file manager was never developed fully, and they used another another kind of interface. I don't remember what kind is it, but in the popular culture, people understand that this was a file manager. Minority Report was one of the biggest influential movies in the technology, but especially for UI designers, because in 2002 there was a lot of future predictions. The designer was John Underkoffler, and he imagined a world where the interfaces had a lot of gesture, but gesture comes after a lot of years, and also the system used in the movie used machine learning before it was invented. So such a technological prediction, very, very accurate, and very interesting to look at to these interfaces 20 years later. Also, in the cinematic universe, one of the most predominant part of technology is in the superhero movies. I take Iron Man because he's like one of the most technological superhero, and in their first movies especially, we have a very interesting interface in a phone. In the real world, this interface is not very realistic, because there was a lot of components with less space, and the contrast ratio is not the better one, but it looks like very technological stuff. So I think the movie wants only to represent something of the future, represent a future interface and not a realistic interface. So it's a very, very interesting. Also, in Iron Man 2, he have like an artificial intelligence, and he asked for information on a person, and the AI open something like, I don't know, a browser or an application that scanned web resources, and okay, the impact on visual design is really great, but as we say about the smartphone interface is not so realistic, because there was a lot of components overlaid and with a very, very ununderstandable contrast ratio. So in the real world, an interface like that could be too much entropic. Also, we have this screen from Men in Black 3, and it's interesting to make an observation about, because as you notice in the 80% of the interfaces in the technological movies and TV shows, the interface is in dark mode. The colors are most of the time without black or dark background, and the content are represented in blue or cyan. And I think that's because it's a very big contrast ratio on the screen, so they don't care that people that watch the movie read properly the text, but it's very impactful and looks like something very technological. So I think the choice is it's just about the visual part, and also most of the time these interfaces are represented in big screen. So imagine a very big screen in a movie scene with a white background. I think it could be a little noisy for who watch. Another interesting representation of UI was in Silicon Valley, and then it was, yeah, because it's finished, a TV shows that that follow a group of developers that create some startups, and despite the TV show was pretty recent, the UI design showed is like a nightmare. Looks like a CRM in the 2000s, but it's okay because the startup was created by tech people that probably don't mind about the design. So, but an interface like that is very, very entrophic. There was a lot of components with a minimum space between them, and the contrast ratio between the box background and the components background, like the select input form, was very, very low. But we can't of course we have to talk about Star Wars. Since its beginning, Star Wars was the most inspirational saga, talking about technology in a cinematic universe. The famous Princess Leia holographic message is a must. And but I want to focus more on the new chapter of Star Wars saga, which has have a very well done and realistic UI. The Kylo Ren control panel interface doesn't have the typical entropy and the colors of other movies interface, and it's very clear, simple, and well designed. And I want to mention about the hacking scene, because in the movies and in the TV show, most of the hacking scene are pretty unrealistic, especially because in the real world, it's a very long and complicated process to be represented, and most of the time when it's not realistic, looks very funny, like this scene in NCSI. Sorry, I made a typo, where the computer of their computer was hacked by someone, and to stop the hacking, they start to type on the keyboard with 4 hands. What the hell they're doing? Okay, we never know. I hope to make it fast, but I want to talking about an hacking-like scene. I want to analyze with you one of the most detailed scene I have ever seen. The Secretary of Iron Man, of Tony Stark, wants to break into the villain's computer to save some files on a pen drive. Let's see together how realistic the scene is. When she opened the computer, she have a login screen, simple and pretty realistic. She have a pen drive, as we mentioned. After she put the pen drive in the computer, she have an alert that is not centered on the screen, and it's very, 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 very annoying. And then after the alert appears, she have a mysterious process on the screen, but we can't imagine what it's happening. The mysterious application discovered the password, so she could have the access to the file she wanted to pick up and put on her pen drive. The computer have a lot of local drives, hundreds. She scrolled, then she found the local drive where the folders are on. She found the secret drive and and the computer opened very fast all the file contained in the local drive. And I don't know, when you open something like a list of folder in a drive, all the files contained doesn't open without your consent. So, but it's not happening in the Iron Man world. The secret folder is named Ultra Secret, and it's very, very funny. She can translate the video, which is present in the secret folder, simply writing translate on the keyboard, and it's a very, very cool feature. She's copying the folder in her pen drive, but oh my God, why is not centered again? But the bad guy, the villain, is here, and the copy is still in progress. The download is complete, and she's clicked screensaver on a white drop-down menu. So I don't know how understand all the other menu items, but apparently she can. She left, but when the bad guy opened the computer, and the message is still there, but in a different position, and is understand that she took something ultra secret, probably, on its computer. But I want to mention one of the best representation of UI design we have in the pop culture. I didn't know the song and the video, but it's very, very popular in the design community. In this videotape, Kelly Rowland send a message to her boyfriend using Excel on her phone, and she's very, very mad because her boyfriend don't ask to her messages. But okay, I didn't know that Excel could send and receive messages, but it's very interesting to understand the director why choose this app to represent a message application. So I want to thank you very much. I hope you like the revival party and the pop culture part. If you have some question, please join me in the Q&A session. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you're very welcome. I'm really happy to have friends all around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really enlightening talk. There's so much to cover in such a relatively short period of time, right? If we think about the designs of cars that, from the 20s to now, I feel like we've gone through as many or more phases of dramatic changes.
Yeah.
Since that first website. So let's see, I welcome, anyone here to post a question in the chat as well. I can read any questions from the Clouder interface. So I expect, I think I'm looking in the right place on the Clouder. If you type a message there, I think I should be able to see it.